Hi. This week was a lovely week to do, actually, and the heading this week is Stuckness to Awareness. And the overall laying aspect of this, as has been for a very long time, but it's raising its head quite a bit, is, as always, the ability to see oneself and to have an inner perspective of that. And the real overlying aspect this week was a fish who is in water can't see the water. And this is a massive hurdle. It's a massive blind spot, because in coming here, it isn't a blank slate. We come with incredible gifts and capacities. And I would even say that those who are here in present time are masters. And when you have mastery, but you can't see it, and you feel ordinary, and you can't really see yourself in a way that sees self, life can become pretty grim, and also not feeling connected to self. So it's a very important thing to be able to see that in coming here, we dive into the water because we want to swim. We want to come and swim. And when you have mastery, which I feel many do have, or are on the way to one way or another, the joy of diving into the water. And we're here again in this aspect of connecting with that gift of growth and self-expression and exploring and expanding. That can get very lost if we dive in, don't realize all that which is within, and then become focused in certain directions, where one being that I was seeing was particularly capable of standing in parts within the water that are extremely toxic, and to be able to view it and be with it and see how life can be lived very, very differently. But when you go from one spot to another spot, and then you notice another spot over here, the spirit got incredibly tired, like, I can't do this anymore. Like, I came here to swim, and all I'm doing is getting stuck into the depth and the profoundness of what the world can become. So to feel reinvigorated, that to swim is very much part of that, and that aspect of loving the diving and just swimming in the water for the sheer experience and joy of it. Without that coming into one's being, the mind takes over and it lives in those spots, forgetting the joy of diving in. So the next one was interesting as well. There's this, we all come with different capacities and also different depths of what we know within ourselves to be the core value of what it is we carry within. And this pattern I've seen once before. I know it's a sprinkling and it's a sliding scale. We all are on a sliding scale of everything. And what was happening here was that over the decades, she had remained very true to herself. And there was a depth of valuing simplicity. The safety was there, the comfort was there, the joy of what was happening in her life was in a fabulous place. What over the decades had happened is that the mind thought it had to mind that, it had to work for it, it had to separate off from others who were doing different ways of being in the world to her. And the other time this showed up really deeply was someone who I saw had an incredible aspect of mothering. It was so deep. It was almost like deeply silent in its knowing that going into the workforce and creating a career, and it was that all her friends were doing around her was kind of alien. And the silence and the staying with the depth of that process of mothering was in such a contrast that it was difficult to recognize oneself in it to that extent, because the contrast with the activity in the world it just didn't make sense to her, nor did it to this woman. And to hold a value against what's generally going on in the world as each decade comes along, if taken over by the mind, you feel you're on track. But there's this disturbance of energy that feels it has to guard it or has to work with it. And once it's seen for what it is, the mind doesn't have to mind it anymore, because it's so clearly who I am that the battle goes away. So again, it's like a stuckness arrived, and awareness was great relief. So there were, this what I'm talking about had all different ways of showing itself as the sessions progressed through over the weekend. So again, the next being wasn't feeling, just not connected, not feeling herself. And all these people are actually really big, capable beings. And she had created in her life a space where she was available. And in that being available, the availability was there for the father and the mother, for appointments, and for the sister who was going through different whatever it is. And that being available, there was what I can only call a shadow side that looked at this generosity and availability, and this shadow side was looking for an excuse to be able to stop. So it created all these lacks and concerns, and what about this and what about that, and how am I going with this and what's going on here, and this process just kind of ballooned, and this energy was like a body of whatever without a head. It's like it had created a body of feelings. And what was really good in this was that it was interesting that it didn't have a head, and it showed up even at the beginning. I can handle this. I have the energy for this. The left side of the brain can do it, the right side of the brain can do it, both are all okay, but there was no hearing to it, because this body of information, this evidence we can sometimes collect to that actually makes sense to the mind, but not to the spirit, because the spirit in its beingness and in its openness and in its capacity actually recognized that no matter how big this shadow becomes, it's not going to win anyway, because who I am will continue. But to recognize it, the shadow actually disappeared, it just disappeared, and the joy of the capacity and being able to returned, and the feeling of self returned. And then as a contrast, the following was the opposite. It was like a head with no body, if that can make sense to any of you at all. But what had happened here was, again, a massive capacity that came into the world. But as soon as it came into the world, it used its capacity to have a sense of expectation, and also the ability to see that prejudices that people carry, to blend it together, to be able to see how others can move forward, or how I can hold myself so others are safer and can move on with their train that they're on. But in time, and I'm talking decades, these train tracks are all other people's train tracks, and no matter how brilliant you are at those train tracks, it's not your train track. The head manages all of that, but there's no body of self attached to it. And in seeing that, because she was feeling like she was nowhere, because this wonderful transition is happening of putting herself in the foreground and have that skill in there for wherever she wants it, but not to become foreground, to be seen as the skill that it is, and then move into her own sense of moving forward in life and jumping into the water and enjoying, because she's an incredible, joyous being, in truth. So there were two others that I actually want to share. I thought I would leave them out, but honestly, they're too good to not share with you, these particular ones. And again, decades, both of them, decades and decades. And because it's decades, that is the stuckness, because it feels so familiar. We identify with it, and then it feels like we are that, but something doesn't feel like it's me, like something's running me, rather than this is authentically my swim. So this one that had been going on for decades, and it's no small thing to be living the life this being is living, but in all the circumstances that had come, that really came to a head, that felt like it was almost impossible to meet and resolve, actually got resolved. Standing by and watching this was amazing, because that it would get resolved was so clearly felt and seen by myself, actually. And then, but they would waver in the seeing of it, because it was massive. And yet it came that peace had arrived. And different stages of her life were pretty overwhelming. And to go through all of them, to finally find this resting place. And this resting place, as it arrived, ironically, gave her that sense of stillness. And in that stillness, all the anger and hostility and vengeance from way, way back, childhood, infanthood, came to the surface like something that just wanted to sprout out. But not being aware that that was going on, even though everything had resolved, it was macinating over all the things that people didn't do or didn't arrive with, or the time that it took, or that could have been, but that it was like this rage showed up. But when it was seen, it's because you know calm, you can actually feel it and release it. But it's not to do with this particular circumstance, it's to do with all of it. And to absolutely recognize that, and it's like you could see it leaving her body and just going away, so that finally in the resting place she could actually rest. The other one brought a gift into the world with herself that is mastery. And I'm going to draw it here because I don't know how else to really speak it. So it's like she was born with the capacity to be at this point, and in being here in present time, she could see the outcome. And it's pretty much like the work of Joe Dispenza and others who actually go, you feel the presence of it and therefore it's there. But that was like a natural go-to. So she sees it and was outcome. But how it showed up was, you are being run by outcome. The outcome and the connection to outcome is running you, because to have a skill like that is so valuable in the world that others were doing all of these that she saw outcomes to. So she was doing all of those because it was so outcome orientated, and because she could see it, why not do it? But when we do that with too many things and we can't see we're run by it, it actually turns into a problem. And again, the joy is missing. So it's about, sure, the people appreciated her, like, oh my God, where'd you find one of these? Yeah, they do the work of 4 or 5 people. So she got very clear about the bits that she could see that she did not want to do anymore, and also her own projects that were falling behind because she was so busy there. These are like, that'd be great, one day I'll do that because I can see it, but I'm so busy over here. And by really selecting what that capacity is, she could re-see her life in a way of living her life rather than being run by this brilliant way of being in this world, seeing the outcome and then doing it. Because part of mastery and a lot of the issues we have in the world is this instant world. I feel it, so I want it now. And a lot of the bipolar energies are related to this, where they feel it, they want it, but there are no steps in between. There are no pathways to it or discipline in the pathways. Where this being had already, that capacity of mastery existed even just in arriving. So the awareness of self is to see the perspective of self not as what's generally happening, but what it is constelled within yourself. When that awareness arrives, we feel ourself and we can move joyously in the pool we've jumped into. So the readings that came up for us generally were actually quite fitting. One was Hybertia, which is part of the Australian bush essences. And the negative conditions are fanatical about self-improvement, driven to acquire knowledge, excessive self-discipline, and superiority. Now, these weren't actually seen by the beings that I saw. They already had these capacities, but by overdriving it becomes a problem. They definitely, none of them had a sense of superiority. They're incredibly humble beings. The positive outcome, content with own knowledge, that which is that inner connection and knowing it. And acceptance and ownership and utilization of own knowledge. So it says here, it's for people who are strict and regimented or even fanatical with themselves, or for those who use their knowledge to gain an upper hand. And as I just mentioned, that's not what was happening. They were blind to the full capacity of the mastery that they had. That was like water to fish to them, and they couldn't see it, and therefore the perspective gets so skewed that you don't feel you're in your own life. So they constantly devour information and philosophies purely to make themselves better people, but often without truly integrating it. It's hard to integrate when you're a fish in water, what water is. But seeing it, the swimming can be enjoyed. In the positive mode, these people will be accepting of themselves and their own inner knowledge and experience without wanting to be superior to others, which they weren't. But it's an interesting insight. Very often these readings are paradoxical in some way, where when you read it in a way that fits those experiences, and it changes the words completely. This, interestingly enough, matches it really well, and it's the card of awakening. Rousing from the inactivity of the past, or having held yourself back, well, not seen, I would say, or having held yourself back. Now is the time to wake up to what can be achieved and shake yourself into action within. Awaken to your potential, awaken to your love, awaken to your self. So don't let the shadow win. Be the joy. Laugh at the shadow and go, I know what you're doing. It is the sabotage. I know what you're doing. But when we're clear within ourselves, we go, there's too much wonderful swimming to do here. Enjoy. Lots of love. Bye.